Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to introduce you guys to Mariah Humphreys, my good friend. Mariah and I have just gotten to know each other over maybe the past year or so. She is a Muskogee citizen, and she can tell you more about that. She now lives in Alabama, but moved there just how long ago, Mariah? You were in Waco for a long time,
A year ago.
a year ago. And she this year has been contracting with Fellowship Southwest as our Native Justice consultant. So, Fellowship Southwest has, as many of you know, four priorities that we focus a lot of our compassion and justice work on. And Native issues is one of those. And we have felt very a little behind in that territory, not exactly sure how we should proceed or what our role in that work is. And so Mariah graciously agreed to come alongside us and prepare us for this work and help us to do it really well. So we're very, very lucky to have her. She's an author. She's a activist, a great advocate for Native people and Native communities, and a Christian. And she brings a whole lot of wealth of knowledge to this world. Right now, she just transitioned also to a new role as the executive director of the Center for Formation, Justice, and Peace. And that is based out of Nashville, and she commutes up there. So really important work that she's doing there. And I told her before, I think that based on the election results, the work that she's doing at this organization is going to be really critical for all of us, for healing and for helping us find a way forward. So I know she's ready. She's the woman for the job. Mariah, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm kind of like sweating, hoping that I can actually live up to all these things that you just said about me. So yeah, thank you for the intro. That was yeah, it's weird to see yourself described by somebody else. So thank you for the kindness.
Well, and plus we've just really hit it off. We feel like we are kindred spirits and we have a lot in common. So I just like you.
Yes. We've been on some road trips, had a lot of conversations.
Yes, we sure have. So we are here to talk about Native issues, and particularly because this is Native American Heritage Month, and Mariah is graciously giving us some of her time, which she has said this month is typically very exhausting for her. Do you want to start with that and talk about this month and kind of what it brings up for you?
Yeah, this is probably Native Americans' least favorite month, because it usually is all hands on board of like, I know a Native person. Can you please come in, say something or, write this article or come to this conference. And so it's usually a lot of nativeness all at once in November. And so usually I'm pretty swamped. I think we were talking about a couple weeks ago how this year I'm like, oh my gosh, I've because of my current role, I dramatically reduced the amount of things that I did this month. And so I'm actually just kind of getting to enjoy being native this month and seeing everybody else talk about things and instead of stressing about the next deadline. So it's been kind of nice. This is one of the very like one of two things that I'm doing this month. And so it's been very relaxing. And this must be what other people experience during these months. So it's so good. But yeah, it can be a lot because it's the fall, right? So we also have Halloween and we have costumes and it's football season and still baseball season, for the first part of fall and
Mm.
have mascots and all the different things. And so it's just a lot of things for Native people in the fall, but it's almost over, and thank goodness for that. So next we'll just like move on to Christmas and Native Americans will be forgotten and we'll just, here we go all over again. And it won't be until next October that we'll come back to it. But it's been, yeah, it's a great month to just be able to, I mean, it's more history than heritage, I think, and just kind of bringing people along with realizing who we are and the beauty of it and the complexity. And we're definitely not monolithic, how we have hundreds of cultures and languages and regionally we're based in, have just different histories. And so it's just really, I mean, I think it's a beautiful month, as long as you're not the one being exhausted by it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Native American History Month, Heritage Month, it's all good. And it's just a beautiful way to kind of share what we have been, who we are now, and some of the concerns, and then just the beauty of the culture in general. So,
Hmm.
mhm.
Okay, well, you teed me right up for my question about Thanksgiving because you're talking about
Oh,
holidays in
nice.
November.
Nice.
Okay, let's talk about this. I don't know if everybody understands that Thanksgiving is not necessarily a happy holiday for Native people. Give us your take on that, and how should we, as non-Native people, think about it?
Um, I told you I would talk about Thanksgiving. And also, I hate getting the question about Thanksgiving because it's usually the should we be making a turkey? Should we be doing celebrations on Thanksgiving? And it's usually that sort of thing. And I'm like, whatever I say is not going to change your mind on whether you have a Thanksgiving meal or not. So I'm not going to tell you not to make your turkey. Make your turkey, have all the things, do whatever. Whatever I say is not going to determine whether you have people over at your home on the last Thursday of the month, right? Um, but I think that it is, I don't know, I think that it's important to consider, because by the way, Native Americans are also going to be having Thanksgiving. Not all of us. There are some people who are pretty staunch advocates against Thanksgiving. And so there's, a lot of Native Americans who feel that way, and rightfully so. But majority of us are still going to be gathering with friends and family on
And
Thanksgiving.
you do.
And yeah, I do. And we don't talk about a story. We're just grateful for each other. And so we kind of reclaim the day that way. But I think one of the things that's a little bit more important to talk about rather than, are you telling me I can't have Thanksgiving, is how to not appropriate Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
Because Thanksgiving is not going anywhere. Like it's here to stay. Like no one's going to stop having it. So how can you best go through that bit of that holiday, and especially the day of, and not appropriate Native culture? I think there are ways that you can do that, and not everyone does that well, right? But I think honestly, unless you've done the work of learning about Native peoples, you have a solid awareness of either some or broadly, specifically, whatever it is.
Whatever it is, yeah.
If you are trying to include any sort of Native focus to your day, probably what's going to happen is it's going to be a little bit more problematic. I don't make the rules. This is how it goes. But if you haven't done the work, you simply just don't know how not to appropriate, because even people who are doing this work of justice and awareness of Native culture still appropriate Native culture. It's just so prevalent in our broader society. So many of us do it. I mean,
Yeah.
I hope I don't, but the broad us, I think, just is so common to step into that.
Well, we're taught to do it since kindergarten.
I know. I mean, we're going to have childcare centers and elementary classrooms. I mean, all
All the
around,
art, all the crafts, all the Thanksgiving themes, and some
all
of them are pilgrims and some of them are Indian. Like that is so ingrained in us.
it is the most common thing. I mean, this is the time of the year where natives get the leftover construction paper, I usually say. Like, this is when you use the yellows and the browns and the oranges and the reds, because we are like the dullest of, communities.
I
So
love those colors.
I like those colors. And so it's one of those things where we're just gonna the little arts and crafts, the parades, the little kids walking through with their, pilgrim and Indians outfits and telling the story. Some are gonna have the great idea of coming up with their own native name, just all these different things of like, oh, just don't. I think you can celebrate community and be grateful for one another without also bringing in a history that we don't really quite comprehend. Because I think the history between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims was not this Thanksgiving meal. It was super complex, and it had a lot of issues going on. And I think if you're a historian, you can grasp that. But it's it's a complicated time. It's like for me it's I'm never going to tell you not to talk about native things except for at Thanksgiving. At Thanksgiving, just leave us alone. Don't put us on tablecloths, don't put us on little things on, the tablescape, on your paper plates and napkins, like just
Mhm.
don't, appropriate turkeys. Like turkeys are huge that day, like just put them everywhere. I mean, they don't care. And so just I think
That we
that's
know of. They might
that
care.
yeah, you know what? That's probably a whole other level of justice that we haven't really stepped
Right.
into. And maybe even like maybe don't even have real turkey. I mean, if you're really going to be an advocate,
Right.
but I think that is that's one of the most common things that we don't understand is you mentioned like children.
Mhm.
This is when we learn these things. This is
Mhm.
when I started learning these things. And luckily for me, I had a native mom who was like, yeah, we're not going to believe that. This is who
Mhm.
you are. We're not going to do that. She even kept me home from those days. Hey, the Thanksgiving parade's coming. She's like, yeah, we're going to stay at home that day. And
Yeah.
so it was like, don't even participate in it. And I think that's one of the things we don't quite grasp is, whether it's our Sunday school classes, even, I think is a good example, or classrooms, small children, this is when we start forming this foundation of how we view one another and how we see other communities and how we see other cultures. And it's always comes to a defense of, but this is a really good story of friendship. I'm like, it's just not a true story. I mean, if it was a true story, it'd be one thing, but it's just not. And so there are other ways that you can celebrate nativeness without telling the story that did not have like the best outcome. So I think it's one of the most ways that I think the U.S. public school system and the private school system appropriates in the most. And it's too bad because it has a really good opportunity to really have those difficult conversations at a childlike level where they could approach it differently. And we just we just don't. So yeah,
Mm.
have your turkey. I'm totally fine with it. Eat your green beans. I don't care. Have corn. So cool. I'm gonna have all the things, but I think when I think when we attempt to bring in another culture that we just don't have a comprehension of, it's just never going to go well. It's never going to happen without causing some sort of issues, and not even issues necessarily. You don't even have to have native there to have it be offensive. It's just the continuation of this mindset that we have of other people and
Mm.
how they stay other. And so we just have to think about that. If we really cherish the native story and the pilgrim story, if we really thought that they were super friendly, then how come our whole history proves otherwise? So anyway, that's a whole rant about Thanksgiving, but we're going to have it. Everyone's going to be doing their own thing. Whatever you do, I think just focus on one another and maybe just like don't talk about us that day. It'd be really good. If you do, then tell the appropriate stories. There's children's books that talk about Native identity from a children's perspective. Read one of those instead, whatever it might be. Just
And those books to me, I always want children's books
yeah,
recommendations.
I've got several. I'll definitely
Yeah, I can share them. Um,
add them
well,
to the show notes. Yeah,
I told you I got to hear Robin Wall Kimmerer speak
I
last week.
know.
One of the most amazing Native writers right now, I think. And she said something about gratitude, like the way she started her speech was that gratitude is our first responsibility. And I think that's a good way to approach Thanksgiving. I mean, that is what it's about. So
Yeah,
that could be a good way to, honor our Native friends too, is
yeah, true.
gratitude. Mhm.
She's so great.
So
I'm
great.
so jealous that you got to you just listened to her speak, but I'm like, oh my gosh, Cameron got to spend time with Robin. How amazing is
Yeah,
that?
I know. I mean, we made eye contact, actually.
She
So,
knows who I am.
yeah.
She saw me. Yeah, that would have been so great. And I think she does a really good job of um, bringing what I think a lot of us, even as Christians, what we really appreciate, like we appreciate going out and getting in nature and, God's beauty. And I think she just does a really good job. I mean, she does not identify as a Christian, but I think she does a really excellent job of bringing that native perspective and kind of just combining it with that beauty of creation. I think that's just lovely. I mean, in braiding sweetgrass, she shares creation story, the Potawatomi creation story. And I mean, it's just so great. I mean, anytime someone can spend a whole chapter and keep me enthralled about, like nuts on the ground that have fallen, like
Yeah.
acorns, I'm there. I mean, if you kept my attention to describe the beauty of a blade of grass, then well done. And she just read her books, everybody. That's the biggest takeaway.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And she has a youth version of, or a young adult version of Braiding Sweetgrass you were just showing me too. So, which I kind of want not just for my kids, but for myself. It looks like it's got good pictures in it and everything.
Yeah, and it might be easier to read.
Yeah,
She-
yeah. But it
She's
is,
so
it is.
complex.
She has really, really beautiful writing. And she talks about, I was going to ask you about your experience in education as a Native person, and she tells a story of how when she was first in undergrad, she was going to major in biology or botany or something like that. And she went to, a regular institution, very Western institution. I
Right.
can't remember where she went to school. Do
I don't
you?
remember either.
Um, and she had to choose a thesis for her first year, for her freshman year. And her thesis was something about the question that she wanted to explore was something about why do the asters and the goldenrods look so beautiful together? Why do they always grow together? Is it because they look so beautiful together? Something like that. And her professors laughed at her and said, "That's not a science question. You should go to art school if that's what you want to know." And, a couple other questions like that that she tried and pitched to them that came from her immersion with the land and with plants and her native growing up and understanding of the world. And they didn't see that as science.
Yeah.
And so she talks a lot about now as an older woman, like how she wishes that back then she was able to embrace her sort of two lenses of traditional indigenous knowledge and Western science. Um, but at the time, she felt, ridiculed and silenced for that. So I was curious if that rings true for you and your experience in education.
It does. And not that specifically, because I'm not as brilliant as she is. So, but there's like a whole book that talks about the experience of Native children in the public school system
Mm.
and how so much harm is done. I think one of the ways that I think anytime I would bring in any historical things about my family or talk about family members, because we all have those in school, talk about this or talk about that, bring in this example of something. And anytime I would bring in every now and again, my mom would say, "Oh, you should bring in this," and it'd be like a native artifact. This was, beaded by whomever, and, take this, and it was beaded from this stone or whatever, which is connected to this project that you had to. And I would take it in like just there was a disconnect with a native culture or something that was cherished in the native community, a disconnect with what a Western lensed teacher was asking for. There was just it was very similar to like that. I think a good example also is, it's not my example, but in Canada, one of the things that's happening is there was this hospital that was trying to combine efforts with Native physicians. And so they're trying to create like this center. And it was with cancer treatment, I believe. And so they're focused on cancer, the specific kind of cancer. And then the Native physicians were like, we need to approach it wholly. So we also need to approach it in different parts of the body and consider this and this. And they're like, well, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for just this. This is the point of it. And they said, you're missing the point, because it's not about this specific cancer in this specific part of the body. It's taking care of the whole body. And so it's also taking care of the mental and the spiritual and then the physical beyond where the cancer is. And so like we approach it wholly. And they're like, well, but our point is like just talking about the finger, like let's just keep it there where the point is. And they're like, you're missing the whole body. And so I think there's just that disconnect of considering culturally within, and I'm not perfect. And I'm not saying that I have all the things correct when it comes to Native culture, but you just, through that lens, you consider additional things and what feeds into that, because you just see a lot of things in life as this collective. And I think that's one of the I think that's one of the opportunities that the church has is we usually see someone as a whole person, and we try to take care of that total person. And instead of just like, well, this is your one sin, or this is the one area where you need to work on, and you think of them corporately, I think that's where we've got a great opportunity to do that, and we don't. But anyway, that's me and it's me and the church. I'm thinking about the church a lot lately, but yeah, I mean, I think there's just a real disconnect between Western education, I think, from little all the way up, right? Where it's just hard to consider anything out sort of outside of that Western lens. I think it same goes with the Black community and that history and that richness that they bring in. The Latino community and the Asian community, there's so much richness that come in from the culture that think of every aspect of our life very differently. And we tend to, since we don't know much about it or it doesn't make sense to us, we dismiss it as it's just not a legitimate sort of thought when it really is. We really should be expanding out a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really good. At one point in her talk, Robin, I'll just be on the
Yeah,
first,
your bestie, Robin. Yeah.
was talking about her two lenses that I keep referring to. And she said, but there are more lenses. We need to actually not just have two lenses, but be like a honeybee, with all the um how their eyes are, with all the lenses. So that's the image that I'm carrying now. And like you said, like just very multicultural, all these disciplines, all these cultures,
Yeah.
something to teach us if we're willing to see through multiple lenses and not just our own narrow vision. So let's do like a little bit of, 5-minute quick studies on some of the biggest issues facing Native
Okay.
communities today. So, I don't know where you want to start. Do you want to start like go way back and talk about boarding schools and talk about that first and go kind of chronologically or
We can do that, and we can talk about President Biden's
hmm?
recent apology that he gave. You want to
Yeah,
do
yeah.
that? Okay.
Okay. Boarding.
Um, yeah. So we'll kind of tackle it that way. Um, as many of you know, or maybe you don't. If you don't, you've heard it here first, I guess. But President Biden recently in October, at the end of October, I think it was the 25th, um, visited the Gia Crossing Community School in Levine Village, Arizona. So in the region of Fellowship Southwest, to make a formal apology, an acknowledgement at which he apologized for the boarding school era. Now, this was already done in Canada years ago, so we've seen it happen there. But Biden's apology caused some tenseness, I guess would be a good way to say, within the Native community. And so he apologized for the Civilization Act, which was in 1819. It's also known as the Indian Civilization Act, which was enacted to take care of the US's Indian problem. So it was the beginning of the boarding school. So today we know this act as the boarding school era. And so the boarding school era led into other intentional separation of Indigenous families and all that sort of thing, which we can get into. But during this era, we know that in the US alone, not including schools in Canada, that we had 417 institutions that were opened up across 37 states. Some at that, depending on when it was also territories. But the motto, as a lot of you may know, was kill the Indian and save the man. So the goal was to remove any aspect of nativeness in younger generations, full assimilation into Eurocentric form of Christianity, right? So Native children were removed from their families, their community, their land. They were forced into this environment of abuse, and sadly, in all aspects of abuse that you could think of, separation, and then also their healthcare was just extremely anemic, like if they had any at all. So resulted in a very oppressive atmosphere that was also encased in Christianity that was forced, right? And so it's one of the most horrific eras of our country. And I think even MLK talked a bit about the removal of and how we were treated in this country, and how that really established how then the US would treat every other sort of community that came in. But the boarding school is absolutely one of the worst things I think that the US has done to the Native community. So in October, President Biden visited this school to give this apology. And so he himself called it one of the most horrific chapters in American history, right? So he's like, I formally apologize to President of the United States for what we did. It's long overdue. So
So this is good, right?
it's good. It's needed. It's absolutely even overdue apologies need to happen, right? Like it needed to happen, and it was long overdue. And so the interesting part about this apology was the timing of it. So it wasn't that it happened or where it happened, because it could have, almost happened anywhere in the US when it comes to boarding schools. It wasn't necessarily that it happened in outside, that it could have happened outside of Arizona. It happened inside Arizona, and it happened 2 weeks before an election, where it was a tense election. And it happened in a state where conveniently, in 2020, the Native American vote was widely promoted as significant in the election of President Biden.
Mm.
So that is where some of the concern came. It was in a swing state, it was, or a battleground state. It was 2 weeks before an election, and it was some time after the process of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative that Deb Haaland put into place in 2021. It was sometime after those volumes had been released that he decided to do this. And so that's where like that tug and pull, like, yes, the apology needs to happen. It was so good. I mean, the apology itself was fantastic. If you can read the transcript on the whitehouse.gov, but it was so good, so needed. And it just, the timing was just felt very tokenized. The Native community felt very tokenized in that moment. It was not a good look, even though the apology was fantastic. I mean, you had the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative reports. The first one was released in July of 2022. The second one, July of 2024. That would have been a great time for him to visit Arizona. Well, maybe not in the middle of the summer, but you know what I mean? Like it would have been a great time for him to make this statement as these reports were being released. And so it was, the sitting president kind of coming in, and I don't believe it was necessarily fully performative, but it did come across with that performative sort of atmosphere, almost like the Land Act that we can talk about, how that can be performative if there's nothing deeper. So the work of Biden, he has done quite a few things for the Native community. Deb Haaland, it was,
I was going to ask you to talk about the importance of her
it's,
role.
she's probably one of the most important roles. She's Secretary of the Interior. And what a lot of people don't know is the Interior is where any of the welfare and anything for Native Americans, it's housed underneath the Interior, which doesn't make sense. It's with land and, everything else that's underneath there. But so having her there is very significant because she shows why representation matters. She's Laguna Pueblo, or Pueblo of Laguna. And so she understands the Native issues. She has lived it, she knows it, and she knows what needs to happen. And she's made it happen, which was fantastic. I'm going to be mourning when she leaves as Secretary of Interior because it is a significant loss. So she's been huge an advocate for Native peoples, and that's really important. But it's also important of the timing of when things happen. And yes, it needs to happen, but it needs to be in a time where, um, especially something this significant, where there's no question in motivation. And sadly, this apology, is as good as it was, came at a time where the motivation was definitely questioned. So it was the first time he had visited tribal land in his presidency, which is, good. Um, and so those are frustrating things that happen because it's like, oh, it didn't have to happen that way, but it did. And so that's kind of the boarding school is such a huge, huge thing here in the US. Um, Maybe now, like my children's generation will be the first generation removed from having someone directly in their family be connected to boarding schools. Like you just,
Your grandparents in boarding schools?
yes,
Oh,
yes. So that so we've got our parents and some are still alive who were in boarding schools that it didn't end until the 60s. And so it's significant that we address it. And I hope that we continue to address it and take next steps towards healing with that. But yeah, so that was that was recent and it was a bit disappointing, even though it was also, oh, so good. Oh, why did you do it at this time? And
I know.
here,
I
you know,
hate that. I just
it was,
hate
yeah,
that it
just
wasn't all good, but
too many question marks over, too many question marks over it. But yeah, so I mean, the boarding school is a big thing for us. That's one of the bigger things for us. But also, um, did you talk about land back or land acknowledgements?
no, we were gonna.
No, you didn't mention that.
Fine, we were going to, but go
Oh, I
ahead.
mentioned it. Yes, sorry. I'm not listening to myself. I'm the one who mentioned it. Um, it's one of the, I think it's important within this to also, when you talk about performative actions, a lot of things that happen, especially within progressive spaces, is land acknowledgements. And they can be so well done. Some of them are very dramatic and it's like, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. And others are like, hey, here's the land that we're on. Okay, so our lesson today is going to be about this, so very,
Yeah.
very different. But a lot of people are doing land acknowledgements. Very cool, very needed. I think sometimes for me, it's the lowest of the hanging fruit, yet it's such a big deal when people actually do start doing them. And it's whatever. Like you've had a conference twice. A great land acknowledgement always starts it off so nice. And you do work with Native people and for Native justice. There's no performance there. It's just part of the routine, right? Some people, it's all performance based. It is out of need. I was on a land acknowledgement team for a university in Texas, which probably won't surprise anybody, but a university in Texas who was reaching R1 status. You probably don't even have to reach too far in my resume to find out where I worked. But so I was on that. And this question was, is this to reach a status or is this because you really want to make an impact in Native communities? It was a checklist item. It was very performative because we put it on the website and then it's totally under the rug, right? Totally swept underneath. And so that's a performance.
Excuse me.
There's no investment in Native communities beyond that. There's no investment in having a Native voice come in and try to impact the campus. So I think there's a difference there between performative and investment. And so like I think Fellowship Southwest is investing. And I think
Yeah.
even other organizations who use land acknowledgements very performative because that's about all that they do. They can't tell you anything beyond that. They can't even tell you anything about the people that they just mentioned in the land acknowledgement. So I think there's an importance to really learn that history about them. Is there anything local that you can do to invest in the people beyond the land acknowledgement? And then I think one of the things too is don't always ask a Native American to do it.
Mm.
I was it's happened to me quite a bit. Hey, we're going to have I would love it if you would give a land acknowledgement. I'm like, I just showed up to your conference and you didn't think about this before, or I
Yeah.
just came to your event and now you're thinking about a land acknowledgement. So invest in that. I think it's a great way to show that you have made an investment. And so I, I mean, do we give a land acknowledgement? Yeah, I do almost every time I speak. So that is not anything new, but it is so nice when we're not having to be put on the stage to have to do it. It may sound better coming from a Native American. I've heard that many times, and that's fine. I get that, but I think it's also not for us. It's for you. It's for non-Native people to be able to acknowledge that. It's not for our acknowledgement. We know.
Yeah, it makes more sense coming from a non-native person, in my view. Like, we're
Yeah, yeah. I
we're
think it's
standing,
so
I'm
cool.
still in land. I'm acknowledging that this
Yeah.
is, yeah.
I think it'd be so well done too, because I love to hear how people think of, Native people or native land. outside of hearing from Native people. I think it's just really cool to hear how people have done the work. I
Yeah.
think that's the whole point. So
First, check your motives.
yes, yes. But it's
Yeah.
kind of the lowest of the hanging fruit, yet we put it on this platform of like, we have a land acknowledgement. I'm like, that is so great. What else are you doing? I think it's just a good question to ask yourself, like beyond this, where is my awareness beyond that? I think it's a very good step in the right direction. But it is very much just a step. And that's probably a little bit of what Robin was talking about with
Yeah.
that performance land acts. So yeah.
Well, let's keep talking about land and tell me about the hashtag land back movement.
Ooh. So the
Uh,
land back movement. Yes, I have told Cameron many times we love a good hashtag in Native America. So land back is definitely one of those. Um, so it's a layered movement. It's the literal desire to have land given back to tribal nations, like give the physical land back. But I think that there can also be a figurative message with historical dealing, like deal with our history. It goes beyond the land acknowledgement and really starts addressing some things. And I think it can be two-tiered. And so land back can be, we're especially in the region of Fellowship Southwest, seeing a lot of historical markers maybe being renamed, um, uh, passing ownership of public parks and state parks. Tribal nation names are starting to be on park names or areas, regions. And I think all of that is an honoring of land back. Is it ideal to have the actual land back? Sure. I'm not going to deny that. Okay. But I think there is, or combining authorities even where, federal and native leadership kind of work together. I think we see that work beautifully. Sometimes it doesn't work well, but I think for the most part, when both are invested, it works really well, like in our public parks and our state parks and national parks and things like that. I was just telling Cameron right before this started that one way that recently there are some recent ones, but one of them that just happened on Saturday. So I don't know of one that's happened since Saturday in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I know about this because I'm Muskogee, and so this happened for the Muskogee Nation. But in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the city had an event on Saturday to return an area called Council Oak to the Muskogee Nation. When the Muskogee arrived in Indian Territory after the trail or, post Trail of Tears, they went to the highest ground and they built this village near this massive oak. I mean, this oak is still standing today. It is massive. It is so beautiful. And they called it Council Oak, which later became Tulsa, Oklahoma. But in 1936, as they were starting to arrive, um, they needed that high lookout point, right? So they chose this space. They set the ceremonial fire because they had brought the coals from their previous ceremonial fires that since they had to remove from the land, that carry that with them. And so they reestablished everything there. And so that's where they started having their meetings and their council business was done there. And so that's significant because the not only is it a significant location and for the historical side of Muskogee people, but this also is kind of a cool area of Tulsa. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been there, but this is not a fringe area. It's not an outside area. It's like right next to downtown, this cool established area. This is also the same place. And a few years ago, I think it was 2018, just less than a mile away in the same neighborhood where they changed an elementary school from Robert E. Lee to
mm.
Council Oak Elementary, and that was to honor the area. And so that's a good example of land back. They put it back into the ownership, not only the ownership, the care, all of it. And I mean, it'd be high residential area, like it's not cheap land. And so I think that's when it can be really honorable is when there's something to give up. If it's a random spot that's kind of like, take it, we don't use this land anymore, take it back. I think that's also good. Um, but I think whenever there's something that you're actually having to give up, and as far as like opportunity and financial opportunities for a city, then that kind of thing really is a really beautiful sort of thing. So that's a
That's
really good example of land back that's recent.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Um, Robin again, bringing her back.
Great.
So she was talking about how she kind of showed a map of the world, and she was talking about the loss of biodiversity and our climate crisis. And she said it's interesting to look at to pinpoint the places on Earth that are not struggling with a loss of biodiversity, that are actually thriving. And if you overlay native lands on them, they're the same. Um,
Wow.
so places where the native communities have been able to care for the land and have been able to maintain that, not ownership, but that
Stewardship.
relationship, stewardship. Um, the land is thriving, the biodiversity is flourishing, and that people and scientists and even governments are starting to notice that and starting to invite more native voices and opinions into how to save the land.
Yeah.
Honestly, I
I
feel like
mean,
that's something that we
Cal-
see, right? In the United
California's done that. They've started reaching out to local tribal nations to help with wildfires. And so to have controlled fires off season to really help prepare what seems to be inevitable in California. But to be able to have them come in and give their expertise in how do you do controlled fires to really help prepare the land for more of a season like this to where it won't be as drastic or out of control. And so they've been bringing in some native, I guess, environmentalists or just fire. What are they called when they handle fires? I don't know. I don't know all the things, people, but the smart people who deal with controlled fires, because there's a season for it and there's a reason when you do it and how you do it, and so they've been reaching out. Yellowstone, um, there's been tribal nations that are along, the plains that are helping with bison control. We've got a pretty strong history of bison in the western part of our United States. And so having tribal leadership and the people who within tribes that focus on that coming in and helping them deal with, bison population where it's low, where it's high, and just how to navigate that. So yeah, there's a really cool movement, within the outside, like kind of that environmentalist, and just utilizing the knowledge of indigenous people, which there's a reason why, and so they're doing a really good job of bringing that perspective and that leadership in. So it's kind of cool to see.
Yeah. Okay. I'd prefer to talk about land and all those, little beautiful things, but let's shift to a little bit of a sadder topic and talk about MMIW.
Mm, okay.
That's so important right now.
It is. It is. Extremely important. So MMIW stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, which has also been extended out to be missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, relatives, when we're talking about our own people. MMIWG, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and MMIW 2S, which is Two Spirit. And so there's a variety of layers to it, but it initially started off with Indigenous women because there's a real serious issue within the US and Canada with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women there with violence and going missing and just having that life-taking violence happening. And so it draws attention to MMIW, which is another hashtag, draws attention to the high number of disappearances and murders of those Indigenous people. Some of the factors of there being such a discrepancy among statistics and things like that is because the media historically just has kind of ignored disappearances of Native women. I think I think it's really important to mention, we see that a lot with Black women as well. There's a lot of overlap with the treatment of Indigenous women and Black women in the US. And I think that's really important to understand or grasp that that's a real issue. And so, but specifically for Native women, law enforcement has not been great about reporting them as Native women, or they've reported them, or if they've reporting them underneath another racialized identity or just unknown. And so even statistically, we've had a really battle not being included in a lot of statistics. And so really what it is, it kind of comes to attacks on a layer of tribal sovereignty a bit, but which, we can talk about if we need to, but women and children are always the target. Our, MMIW would include like the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970, where there was an estimation of at least 25, but up to 42% of Native women of childbearing age, some as young as 15, were sterilized. There's always that violence against Native bodies, specifically Native women and children. But Dr. Sarah Deer, who's Muskogee, she played a really big role in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act in 2013, because previously Native women had not been included in that act. And so Sarah Deer was a very significant person in getting Native women to be included in the protections that VAWA provides for women in the U.S. But she has like a really good quote.
2013. Is that when that happened?
I'm sorry? Is
that 2013?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the reauthorization there. And then it was really cut and dry, or cut and dry. It was really tight in the last reauthorization in 2019, I believe, because we were almost removed again in 2019, which was, it's just always going to be a battle, right? But she's got like this quote that's really good that I use quite a bit, because a lot of people say this is an epidemic. And she says, using the word of epidemic to talk about violence against women in Indian country is to depoliticize violence, rape specifically. She said it's not a fundamental misstatement of the problem. It's like rape in the lives of Native women is not epidemic. Instead, it's a fundamental result of colonialism. And so it's historic. And I think that's really important, because Native women, according to like a great quote of Audra Simpson, who's Mohawk, in her book, Mohawk Interruptus, she talks about how Indian women disappear because they've been deemed killable. There's no repercussion. They're expendable. And so their bodies have been historically deemed rendered less valuable because of what they're taken to represent, which is land, reproduction, indigenous kinship and governance, which is tribal sovereignty, which goes exactly the opposite of a westernized, white settler order. And so the bodies are a lot of symbolic and conflated with land. And so it's really, there are horrific stats, which, we won't go into, but there are really significant stats that show that just more than half at every level of Native women have experienced violence of some sort, from stalking to physical assault to sexual assault, being trafficked to the ultimate of being silenced through murder. And so it's not a regional issue, it's a broad issue through North America. So Canada included, it's just a really big issue. And so there's a lot of work. There's a lot of organizations that have been developed that are specifically for MMIW. And it's a really big, there are reasons for those issues. They're tied in with, pipelines and things like that. And so there's this cyclical mindset of violence against Native people. And so it's almost like you can't talk about one without talking about the next, because they just tie into each other. And so
I know we're short on time, but can you give a brief description of that connection between the pipelines and MMIW?
Yeah, so the pipelines are always going to bring in large scale construction sites, right? So there's always going to be a massive amount of male presence, and majority time that's non-native male presence. And so a lot of these places are very remote. They're not close to anything. And so the closest any sort of cities or towns that they have are on native land. And so it is pretty widely known statistically, even, of the violence that's caused. They call them man camps because it's such a high, intense level of masculinity. And so they're a significant cause for violence against Native women on Native land. And so that's where Violence Against Women's Act comes in, because it kept, we kept being removed from that act because it kept specifically white men from being arrested and tried for violence against Native women on Native land. And so it was a protection for white males to not be considered perpetrators for violence against Native women. And so as those, there's just there's a whole just research done on the connection between these man camps and how the violence rises and murders rise within uh, tribal lands and pipelines specifically, because that's kind of your larger scales that happen close to native lands.
Yeah, it's just it's really interesting to me how those things interplay and intersect.
Yeah, kind of tie together.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last big issue is ICWA.
Yeah, ICWA. So quickly, ICWA, it was established in 1978. And so it stands for the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so it was brought on the heels of the boarding schools. So we had the boarding schools, and then we had the Indian Adoption Act that ended in 1967 that sold Native children to white families on the East Coast. It's a whole thing. You can look it up. So ICWA was enacted because of these projects that removed children from their homes and placed them in other homes. Um, it protects Native children. It keeps them within their communities. It keeps them connected to families, community, heritage, tribal nation, and it prioritizes the extended community. So basically, if you want to adopt a Native American child, you have to go through ICWA. It's considered the gold standard of child welfare. Overwhelming majority of state welfare systems support ICWA. And so what it does is it prioritizes the child's family first, immediate family within that tribal nation. And then it prioritizes families within the tribal nation that are outside of this child's, direct family, but within the tribal nation. And then it would prioritize Native families in subsequent tribal nations. And then if all of those have been exhausted, immediate family, extended family, tribal nations family, and then additional tribal nations families, if none of those can go through the process of fostering or adoption, then those adoptions can be opened to the broader public, which typically is overwhelmingly white families. Those
Mhm.
are, did I just turn myself off?
Yeah.
Interesting. I was looking at the clock. So yeah, so that's kind of what ICWA does. It allows those protections, and so it went to the Supreme Court. It was in November of 2022, actually, so 2 years ago. They heard arguments for and against ICWA, against Brackeen v. Howland, and so I'm not going to praise this man's name very often. If you know, you know, but it's because of justices like Gorsuch, who's actually, for all of his issues, is very well versed in Indian law. And so it's because of his influence through that process that in the summer of 2023, ICWA remained intact. And so ICWA is definitely the biggest issue within tribal sovereignty, which tribal sovereignty is simply the right for every tribal nation to be able to govern and protect their own people. And so ICWA is like the foundation of tribal sovereignty. And so that was extremely important case for Indian country just being broader Native America, because that was so significant to tribal sovereignty. Because tribal sovereignty, if that fails, we no longer exist. Our lands can be broken apart. They can be sold off. Our identities can be kind of just broken down. And so that's a really big issue of protecting tribal sovereignty, and ICWA was significant in protecting that. So that was a really big decision for SCOTUS, a conservative justices to be able to vote or rule in favor of it. So yeah, that was really big.
Another really good victory. Okay, so we just have a few minutes left, and I do want to let you guys ask questions if you have any, but let's ask. I want to ask you about your reflections about the results of the election. And now that we know what we're looking at for at least the next 4 years, what are the big things we can do to be advocates for Native justice? Which of these issues do you think is most at risk, or has most possibility for positive advocacy? What are your thoughts?
I think some of the ways, I mean, ICWA is always something to be keep an eye out on. But I really feel like land issues, specifically within the Southwest, there's always land issues there because of just all the corporations trying to come in and utilize the what's underneath the land, the money underneath it. So um, anytime that we have opportunities as an organization, I think to be able to stand and keep updated on those situations that are going on in Arizona and New Mexico. I know Utah is outside of the area for Fellowship Southwest, but some of the things in Utah, um, just listening to those native communities and keeping track of like what's happening as far as minerals and copper and everything else that we've seen going on in Arizona. I think those are really important to um, protect the native land that way. And there are things that we can do that doesn't require coming in and taking over native land to utilize what's underneath the land. If sometimes I'm like, if we've gone this far without it, do we need it? So go another route. But I think the protections of women, I think always, I think that's one of the biggest things we saw in this election was the protection of women and just the identity of women and what we represent. And as far as our existence, how it can, stoke so much fear in some people.
Yes.
And I think that always being aware of violence against any female body, but Native American specifically, because that's everywhere. MMIW are issues everywhere. If you pay attention, you'll hear about them going on in Canada. You'll hear about things going on, and even in the Northeast. So there's always just those little stories as you start hearing about it. Trafficking is a really big thing, but we don't get included in a lot of the stats for trafficking. And so those are good things to be paying attention to. And as you think about them more, you start hearing about them, and then you can't unhear them and you can't unsee it. And but I think the violence that happens, but then also those native rights, those land rights are really important.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did notice someone's comment, mainly because that comment, it doesn't bother me, but it bothers me the statistic that's out there. There's a graphic out there that was put out there by NBC soon after the election night was over, and it's caused just an uproar on social media over the past week over the demographics broken down on who voted for who.
Mm.
And in one graphic, we're not mentioned anywhere else. We're under other everywhere else, except for one little graphic that decided to break us down under American Indian. And the graphic shows that 65% of Native Americans voted for Trump. And so I saw that and I was like, that can't be right. Like if there's ever a number that I question, it's that because not to be partisan here, but that specific candidate has a pretty strong history of being anti-Native and going to a lot of court cases against Native um, tribal units. So it was
Really?
threw me
Mm.
off quite a bit to see that, and immediately everyone else saw it too, and immediately, sociologists and everybody else within Indian country were like, I question this. So just so you know, that ended up being, I think, what was it? Ended up being 200 people, 2,000 people, I think, when it talked about the Native American breakdown. I think it was 2,050 maybe total. None of those were taken on tribal lands or
Yeah.
where there's a heavy Native population. And so I think you got to consider some of those stats when you see those. You don't have to show any sort of verification when you report as a Native American in an exit poll.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of people out there who claim Native identity who are not. And we also have a lot of Natives who really are, just sucked right into that mindset of supremacy.
That's
Um,
which goes to your point at the sorry to interrupt, goes to your point at the very beginning where you said, you're not a monolith. There's 500, how many tribes? Federally
500 were
tribes?
federally recognized. Yeah. And
Yeah,
then there's
five,
hundreds like of states and then others that are trying to get recognition. So yeah, it's
a lot of diversity. And so there's
yeah,
going to be diversity of opinion. somewhere.
There will be, it's just not that big. It's not-
Right.
I will say it's not that big. And they had a great article that just came out last Friday that showed like, hey, listen, statistically, even up until we just did a massive throughout Indian country, a massive survey over the summer that again walked through stances politically and on how we feel about everything, and it came out to be very much the opposite of what some of those stat came out to be.
Interesting.
But yeah, so yeah, I think just as you pay attention, as you become a little bit more aware, you're not going to understand all the things, and that's totally fine. I mean, it's taken me years to really grasp some of these things about my own people. So, but as you start to hear them, you'll start paying attention, and red flags will pop up or green flags will pop up. You're like, ooh, that's really interesting. So I get a lot of texts from people who are like, hey, is this good? Are we good with this? Or is this a concern? I'm like, oh no, we're good with this. Like, okay, cool, cool, cool.
Yeah.
That was good. So you just start becoming more aware, and then you start saying things.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's definitely been true for me. Um, we are just at an hour. If anyone has any questions they want to ask Mariah, go for it. She also told me that she would be happy to answer your questions. If want to email me later, I can send them to her. Hi, Sandra.
Nice to be here. I've learned a lot today. Totally against leasing for underground stuff going on Native American property. And I'm wondering how I can help Native Americans not let this happen.
Mm. Um, it's going to sound like a broken record, but really, a lot of times it is staying in the ear of your state representatives. I think that, I mean, I write state representatives all the time, and I'm always like, this is not doing any good, but here I go again. But you just never know, right? I think the more people do that, sharing with other people, I think even if just bringing awareness to other people as you become more aware is very important for us broadly. Not just taking the information and not expressing that anywhere. But I think
Mariah, how about money?
mm,
Who fights these things for you?
there are specific Indigenous Native American organizations that do this for sure. But a lot of these, and that's if you're talking about nationwide, but a lot of these are specific to tribal nations. And so they will have usually a foundation within there, or their legal fees or whatever it might be. So it kind of depends on what it is. Broadly, there are organizations and foundations that are out there, institutes, but then specifically, if it's on specific tribal land, it's probably done through that tribal nation directly.
And how would I find out?
So you could even, if there's something that you're kind of aware of, you can look them up, and usually every tribal nation will have some sort of legal drop down, talks about what they're currently involved in, their legal team. Almost everybody has a legal team. And you can reach out to their general counsel that way. And yeah, and they usually will have releases too, like newsletter releases or public statements that keeps everybody up to date. Like I'm subscribed to a bunch of different things that keeps me updated with environmental issues. And yeah,
Could,
things like that.
could something be put into the email that, like what I received about this conference, this Zoom?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
we can do that because it's part of my work with Fellowship Southwest too, is creating this list. So I'll yeah, we
That'd be
can
great.
definitely we can definitely put some of those out there.
Okay.
yeah, that's your question. Mariah, David Park asked about books that you would recommend to somebody that's just starting out on this journey about learning about history, Native history.
Holy smokes, do I have books?
He loves to read.
I do have a couple of books that would be, if you're involved, if you want to be involved in history specifically, there are a couple of books that would be really good. One of them is this one by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Great book. And I can definitely give these to Cameron as well. This is a really important one, Indigenous Children Survive in Some Public Schools. It's an expensive book. It's very academic, very stat heavy. It's by Leilani, somebody, Seblazian. And so it's a really solid book. The reason why I say this one is because it does talk about the school systems. But in this, you learn about the history you've learned and how it harms Native American children and how that goes into adulthood. And so it's one of the top books that I recommend. So if you're into history, I would recommend those two books specifically. And I think those are, I think there are spiritual books as well, like Native by Caitlin Curtis, who's done work with Fellowship Southwest. And I think there's some spiritual books, there's some theology specific books that you can do. Yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass is another one that actually ties in a lot of land, but a lot of science and environment. It ties in a lot of things, and it's a big read, but it's beautiful, beautiful read. And plus it's a beautiful book. So yeah,
It is.
and then they've got
And
the Youth Version.
like you said, she does not identify as a person of faith. I mean, organized religion anyway.
Yeah.
But it is so deeply spiritual. As a Christian, I
So good.
felt like it was really helpful for my spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. There are some great books now that are out about the boarding school.
Look at Megan's question, Mariah.
Is it?
She said, any books or documentaries about boarding school history that you would recommend?
Oh, said that. Yeah. So I actually just I haven't read this book yet. I actually just got it. But Denise Lagimare, I think it's her last name. She just released this book and it's called Stringing Rosaries. And it's testimonies from the boarding school. She's been working on that for a while. You can follow her on social media. She is pretty darn incredible. And so she has done a lot of work with the boarding schools. I think there was, what did even Stephen Reeves just reminded me, was a great reminder. I was like, oh, I had seen that once. Sugarcane is a documentary movie that is out that talks about it. And then there's some just little shows that will kind of mention boarding schools and you'll get an idea of kind of what they were like. So there's like Three Pines, which was a Canadian show. And they talk about boarding schools. It's on a boarding school, talk about it throughout the whole season.
Three Pines, is that the one, the Louise Penny mystery? Is that Armand Gamache? Three Pines?
It might be because someone asked.
I don't know about that book, but there was a show on PBS called Annie of Green Gables.
Oh,
And I mean, there was one that was written, I'm guessing, in the 40s or 50s, but this one was pretty contemporary, like maybe the late 2019, 20, but it got into boarding schools and the horror of them. And it was geared towards children. I mean, I enjoyed it as an adult, but yeah. And then unfortunately, the season was over and they didn't do another season. So it really kind of left you hanging. But it was really, if you have an opportunity to see it, it's really good, really well done.
Yeah, there's a couple of other books that I'll give to Cameron too. Yeah, I love Three Pines. It was a great book, or a great series. There's a couple of other books that have started since the boarding schools, we're now having to do this. And then plus the investigative reports. FSW has shared that before in some of their newsletters of those two reports. And so they're pretty significant too. Yeah. I mean, they're what we really want to read.
Yeah, they're lengthy.
Yes, Reservation Dogs is always a bonus. Yeah. If you freak out over language, maybe not, but there's a lot of things on Reservation Dogs. There's just a lot of Dark Winds is something you could definitely look up. True Detective season 4, Under the Bridge with Lily Gladstone, just some really good things out there.
Okay, well, we'll send this out to everybody because we all love hearing recommendations.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for being here and your good questions. And thank you, Mariah, for all this amazing information.
Anytime.
It's great being with all of you.
Thanks
And
for
if you
doing
have
this.
follow-up stuff, feel free to email me. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.